Good morning. It's Sunday, and I want to share with you a couple of verses which are a little bit controversial today. They have problems in them, and it's from Acts chapter 15. And Paul and Barnabas are traveling, and Paul says this is chapter 15, verse 36. Paul says to Barnabas, "Let us go back to visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." It sounds like a good idea. Review what's going on. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Now, we don't really know exactly what happened. Somehow John Mark, didn't carry on. Later on, we discover that Paul is reconciled to John Mark and actually sends for him to help him in his ministry later on. It may simply be that John Mark was a young disciple, maybe immature, maybe didn't have any stickability, maybe just couldn't cope with the pressure. We don't know. Barnabas, son of encouragement, his ministry was to encourage new believers, including Paul himself, when Paul gave his life to Jesus. So Barnabas obviously had some pastoral gifts. Maybe Paul was a more apostolic, church planting, missionary type figure into new territories. Maybe Barnabas was more of a kind of a trainer, equipper, mentor of new believers, giving them the time to grow. We don't really know exactly what happened. We know that Paul was very disappointed that John Mark abandoned them as he saw it. And so we see this division happening, that they split. They disagreed so sharply they couldn't work together anymore. And Paul takes Silas with him instead. I don't think we can read too much into it. It says that he was commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. Paul was with Silas. Doesn't mean that Barnabas was not commended. It just singles out Paul as being commended and strengthening the churches. But there's a big disagreement. And sometimes in churches, sadly, there are disagreements. And if you've been around churches long enough, you'll know that sometimes leaders fall out. Now, hopefully, they can do it in a good way. And they can do it in communication, being clear about their reasons, explaining their feelings and their emotions. Sometimes, though, it can get a bit ugly. And sometimes that lack of reconciliation can split churches. I've had maybe one church split while I've been in London. It was quite an ugly situation. I'm not going to go into the details of it. But I know it does happen. And so we have to try and stay in good relationships with people. We have to try and be reconciled with other leaders and explain why we react and respond the way that we do. In this case, it led to an expansion of the gospel. In this case, it led to growth in the gospel. And sometimes church planting is done well as part of a plan, as part of a strategy. Sometimes it's done accidentally and two halves of a church just fall out with each other and you end up with two churches. And sometimes that split can last for years and can really be full of animosity. So we have an obligation to try and keep the peace between leaders and between different parts of churches. That's why unity is so important in churches, especially in London, especially in multicultural cities where a congregation may have people of different ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups as well. It takes time to listen to each other and to understand each other. And it can take patience. It doesn't always happen easily. So this is a kind of a warning passage today for us. I hope your church is not facing any divisions or splits, but listen to each other. Try and understand where other leadership teams and and individuals are coming from. Take time to listen to their feelings as well as what they say. Sometimes the feelings, the emotions, are more important than their words. And somebody can be reacting out of a great sense of hurt and damage, even if verbally they sound logical and reasonable. Because we carry all kinds of wounds from the past with us, even as leaders. I knew one leader who had been severely sexually abused by his own father, and he brought that woundedness into his ministry as the leader of a congregation, and caused a lot of damage, in fact, because he overinterpreted what he saw as hostility from other leaders. They weren't being hostile, but he thought they were. Again, we might be from a family background where we were put upon, where we were prejudiced against. We might be victims of a racist background in our lives where we begin to react against perceived or even real racism. And that can cause conflict. So we have to be aware of our own emotional background. There's a famous book called Emotional Intelligence a few years ago, which would repay reading if you haven't read it, to try and understand where we're coming from. Because a lot of times our reactions are not always logical. Our reactions are emotionally driven. And maybe this was what was happening between Barnabas and Paul, the more pastoral and the more apostolic style of leadership. And so within a leadership team of a local church, or in this case, a missionary team, we need to understand each other. There are two different kinds of churches, different forms of church, which were theorized back in the day: the modality and the sodality. The modality is your bog standard local church composed of local people. Some of them are very wounded, very needy, and many of them they're not going to be very active as believers, but they need to be cared for. That's the modality, and you maintain the church. The sodality would be your mission team, like YWAM, monastic teams, apostolic teams, Operation Mobilization, who are self-selected and committed to mission. And both have advantages. The sodality can be very sold out, very committed, give lots of time, often finance themselves to church plants. But the modality, the ordinary church, are often rooted in the local community more, and they have relationships and friendships with people. So they both have advantages and disadvantages. But whatever kind of team you are looking for as a local expression of church, it's important to understand where the people in your church are coming from, their histories, listen to their stories, listen to where they came from, if they're from a different culture or country, listen to their different emotional stories, the stories of rejection, stories of promotion in church, but also be listening to their hidden, unspoken assumptions and stories as well. And that will help you to get through a lot of these problems. So this is a warning passage for us today as churches, to listen to each other, to try and understand each other, and to try and work with each other for the sake of the kingdom. Don't split unless you need to. Sometimes it's necessary, but often it is not necessary. It is important to be united, to work together, to cooperate for the sake of the kingdom. Amen.